You need to go into the game eyes wide open and understand the math and the probabilities. There was a time, I don't know if it was a decade ago or 25 years ago, where people thought they could just throw money at this and make 5 times their capital, like a monkey throwing darts at a dartboard. Like, I don't think that's true by a million miles today.
Search Party is sponsored by Avid Bank, Boulay, Kilpatrick, Oberle, and Plexus Capital. The lead sponsor is Next Coast Legacy.
Hello and welcome to Search Party. I'm David Snow, your host. And today we're joined by AJ Wasserstein, Eugene F. Williams Jr., Senior Lecturer in the Practice of Management at the Yale School of Management, Daniel Lazier, co-founder of Skyline Crest Partners, and Dustin Sellers, Managing Partner of Next Coast Legacy. Gentlemen, welcome to Search Party today. It's great to have you here. We are going to be talking about a recent paper that Daniel and AJ collaborated on out of the Yale School of Management, and it is called How Are Search Fund Investors Really Faring? And so, of course, the topic of our conversation is going to be, how are search fund investors really faring? Maybe we can start with the first question to set the stage with Professor AJ Wasserstein. Why did you think that a paper pursuing this question was warranted?
Yeah, first, David, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm flattered and thrilled to be here. Daniel, thank you for being a collaborator and co-author. You're awesome. And Dustin, thank you so much for hosting as well. So I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my colleague, Jake Thomas, who wrote the paper with us and been a great mentor and coach to me on all things mathematical and statistical and academic research. So, okay, why did we write this paper? Curiosity and hopefully to make the world a better place and provide people with more information. We think the results are worth sharing and understanding if you're an investor in the space, especially if you're a new investor in the space, or you're an entrepreneur in the space, or you're an aspiring entrepreneur in the space. People who are considering this either as a capital provider or an entrepreneur can make the best decisions possible for them with eyes wide open.
I'm so excited to be talking about this and think it's so timely. The fact that I'm teaching at USC in the spring would tell you that ETA is everywhere now, because you wouldn't have expected that, but here we are. You've just got this massive explosion of volume, and that's causing a lot of dust in the air. And there's not a lot of analytics short of the Stanford study, which my esteemed business partner, Anthony, would say is always historically dated. It's not current to the market. And there's been so much velocity and change in the form of capital coming in, deals getting done.
But in general, the Stanford study found ETA investments on average, or at least ones they tracked, tended to have pretty good IRRs in the low 30s, the mid 30s. Is there still an assumption today that that's what people should sort of expect on average out of the ETA asset class? And basically your paper is saying, actually, no, you should not expect that.
We're wrestling with this capital allocation notion. How many dollars do I put into a search fund? Am I taking a pure portfolio approach, or am I doing something a little different? And we find that when we sum those small differences up, while no one factor makes a humongous difference, it's kind of a death by 1,000 cuts, where you end up with some performance that looks really different for that reason.
You know, in every deal, we still underwrite to 35% IRR, 3.5 times gross MOIC in every deal. And fundamentally, best and brightest are still holding to that and still believe that that's achievable. When we say harder, right, everything's gotten harder. Professional sports has gotten harder. That's just the evolution of everything. You have to be more strategic, more thoughtful, greater set of diligence. And that's where, you know, the fundamentals in this paper resonated with Anthony and I quite a bit, of like loss ratios. I mean, that's not something that people historically had to focus on because loss ratios were historically very low. Well, loss ratios are beginning to trend towards the mean, and that's having a profound effect. So I don't think it's harder to achieve that. I think less people are achieving it.
it's important to study this topic through the lens of how an investor might actually experience the ETA asset class.
Yeah.
So what does that mean, and how is that different from maybe looking at it in a different way?
When we engaged in this project, we wanted to research, analyze, and document and report out on returns that investors are actually experiencing in search funds. I think this was the first time there's been a study done on actual investor returns. One thing I found fascinating is sort of the preponderance of outcomes that are below 1.9 MOIC. The percentage of outcomes below 1.9 is 58%, which is stunning. More than half the returns are below 1.9. And only 2% of the returns are greater than 10x MOIC. We call those griffins, mythological creature. Our attempt to have a word like unicorn in our little world. So 58% below 1.9, 2% above 10.x. Like, that's a really, really skewed outcome.
So griffins exist. There's just not a lot of them. Let's talk about that a bit more. Obviously, if you are taking a portfolio approach to spreading your bets across ETA, how likely is it that you're going to come across a 10x exit? And then what would that do to the overall portfolio if you were lucky enough to experience that kind of a win?
The impact is somewhere between a private equity portfolio where my outcomes are pretty closely clustered around a 3 or 2.5 MOIC versus like a venture kind of outcome where I have a bunch of zeros in one, Uber or SpaceX. We sit somewhere in the middle where those outsized returns help pay for some of those, what AJ calls the should have stayed home category of the 2 or less MOIC.
If you miss a griffin, that's going to cost the portfolio, in our analysis, in our sample data, approximately half to a full turn of portfolio multiple. So that is material. I don't want to say it's crushing, but it's the difference between good and great.
Jim Edmonds of Search Fund Partners and I were talking about your paper.
That was a slow day, Dustin. I mean, if you're talking about this stuff, we're going to have a lot of
I like data. I like data. And they're on their ninth fund, I think. And they've all been fairly small funds, kind of sub $20 million, sub $30 million. And they take smaller pieces. But he unequivocally said that across his funds, there are nuanced differences between their middle of the fairway return on gross MOIC is catching one griffin during that portfolio, which begs the question, this idea of going to a smaller number of companies with larger check sizes, if you really look at the historical, it's usually been around 30 to 35 businesses in these smaller funds, which casts the net wider to have the probability of getting the griffin, with the downside of you're putting $500,000 or $750,000 into that deal versus $2 to $4 million. So it's an interesting dialogue about whether you stay in that shoot wide, get great searchers and then wait and hope, or get really, really tighter and do a lot better diligence and look a lot more like middle market private equity.
Yeah, but Dustin, I'm going to politely push back on two fronts. One, when 58% of the outcomes are below 1.9, I'm not sure anybody really has the ability in advance to pick the winners. Like, most of them are not winners. So I assume every time you write a check, Dustin, you do so with conviction and optimism and belief that this is going to be a good outcome. But our data points in another direction. We did a regression analysis, and sadly, investors that made more bets, which intuitively Jake, Daniel, and I would have thought would be the right strategy to catch more griffins, but investors that make more bets do not necessarily have higher portfolio multiples.
One of the things that we talk a lot about is there's the rider and then there's the horse. And most institutional investors would say, well, we're first and foremost investing in the horse because that's where the EBITDA is and that's the business, and we're diligencing that. And then the rider comes on and whips that horse and it rides faster and it wins the race, right? Well, then I don't think we're allowed to whip anymore, but you get my point. So I'm curious in this connection between these two attributes of we can't pick a winner, right? We don't know who the winner is, But then maybe there is a winner more in focusing on the quality of the searcher and that having predestined that outcome better than the 58%.
I have a comment on that actually. So there's no way of really knowing this from the data, but I have a hypothesis on this, Dustin. So I actually
by the way,
think
full disclosure, we are backing Daniel right now as a searcher.
Well, thank you very much for your support, by the way, Dustin. Appreciate that. But so I have this hypothesis that I think there's different strategies that suit different investors. So there do happen to be a couple of investors that sort of uniformly in every category outperform some of their peers. And so I think there's something kind of subtle but important happening there, where there's a strategy that those investors are employing that sort of fits their strengths. So say someone like a Dustin Sellers, who's spent a bunch of time operating, a bunch of time hiring people, a bunch of time working with entrepreneurs. Undoubtedly, you have some sort of skill in being able to select the jockey. On the other hand, I think there are investors out there that are really, really good at picking horses. And so I think there's actually kind of a strategic kind of balance. Certainly the peers, there are a handful of investors in our study that were able to sort of find that advantage and sort of capitalize on it. There's some horse picking going on, and some people I think are successful at it.
Back to the data, it has rubbed a lot of people different ways because everybody does have opinions and they've been allowed to have an opinion for 40 years. And to Daniel's point, there are folks that have just had outsized returns, and the je ne sais quoi has been very hard to put a tangible finger on.
There's a dispersion in outcomes in investors. So it's not like all investors cluster around a certain performance level. So someone is going to be the top decile and someone's going to be the bottom decile. So we at minimum, we have to acknowledge that different investors perform different ways. Daniel and I are working on another project, which is looking at entrepreneur demographics and MBA school, years of work experience, functional work experience, military, gender, a whole bunch of factors. And you can't necessarily capture grit or hunger or sort of these magical things that might differentiate one person from another. So going back to why some investors do better, why some don't, there are some investors that are high status investors. And I can't necessarily explain why they're high status, but they are high status. And they have better access and pick to the talent and more deal opportunities and choices than investors that are maybe lower status. I mean, the very, very best prospective entrepreneurs, they likely want to match with high status investors, and high status investors want to match with high status entrepreneurs. So do investors have pixie dust or magic? I don't know. But some have the ability to wind up in more griffins than others. And it might be because they're high status investors. It might be because they add value after the deal. I don't know.
There's a really nice intersection here, because something Daniel said earlier about the different asset classes between kind of a VC binary outcome, where you're really investing in a founder, in an idea, right? Especially if you're early stage, and middle market private equity, where you don't really care about that. You've got a stable of EIRs. You've been working on the vertical. You care exclusively about the horse, and you are doing diligence.
Good to know.
We are a hybrid of that. We are a true hybrid of that. And that's kind of an epiphany for me. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it's kind of the melding of two asset classes, because on one side, like, your father and his partner, their ability to decide that Ben and I were of the status, not being Stanford or Harvard at the time, but were of that pecking order that we were good. I mean, I spent an hour with them. I mean, they were willing to believe that we were going to be, an outsized outcome. And they picked really, really well. So it's almost like they could pick founders, and they didn't even care that we were looking at outsourced HR or anything of that nature. And they didn't, they looked at our SIM. But then I've got someone like Anthony, who's my business partner, who lives and breathes the diligence side, the data room, the pro forma, the downside case. We have a very low loss ratio. You're not wrong in that it's both, right? And it's play to your strengths and or try to maximize areas where you can create those outcomes through better access to great searchers, but then also recognize that, even a great searcher, mega trend going the wrong direction, can't and will never be able to outrun that train.
I agree with everything you just said, but I think something that might be worth at least highlighting a little bit is that ETA in schools, at conferences, and lots of podcasts and literature gets positioned as a pretty close cousin of private equity, not venture capital. And it might have more venture capital characteristics than we might want to admit.
I think it's moving that direction unequivocally, right? I don't necessarily know if that's good for the asset class from an outcome perspective. So I agree. And I see it just from the types of searchers that are more and more gravitating. They look more and more like finance bros with not operator hat on, but more the portfolio hat on. And the VC space is all about betting on multiple founders and which of the one is going to be able to pivot and create that incredible outcome. I think historically, we weren't private equity. I mean, back when it was 20 guys investing as high net worth individuals in individuals that were coming out of, a specific class being taught at Stanford or Harvard, that was a very different mindset. And it looked a lot more like VC.
Let's talk about loss ratios. Obviously, the research shows that it's important if you can do it to get a 10x in your portfolio. But with 58% of deals performing less than a 2x and some of them performing less than a 1x, you have a lot of underperforming horses and jockeys in the space. So is there a skill, is there a differentiation among investors in being able to perceive who's going to deliver a weak performance or a loss, and how do you minimize that?
What AJ alluded to the regression analysis we did on the quantity of search funds back versus the returns. We certainly didn't see a positive correlation. We also didn't see a negative correlation. So we didn't necessarily see some relationship between bogey avoidance and outsized return. In fact, we saw examples of investors that had really good bogey avoidance, but missed out on a couple griffins. We had investors that had both going for them. They had some good bogey avoidance. They had a couple griffins as well. And then we had an investor that ended up with really good returns that had a bunch of bogeys on the card as well. But the overall portfolio seemed to do well. So I don't think from the data alone, we could necessarily say anything conclusive about the importance of avoiding those losses. But we certainly saw a dispersion in the behavior of investors. And certainly some had the skill of avoiding those less than desirable, less than benchmark outcomes.
Do you see a pattern in why there is an underperformance? Is it typically because you missed something in the due diligence of the company, of the sector that it's in? Did you miss something about the searcher? And is this something that people can control for? Because certainly avoiding bogeys, as Daniel says, also is very important to maintaining performance.
I actually have a bit of a point of view on this. So when I first moved over from like the venture-backed startup domain into the search fund domain, I was really lucky in that I came to this office and had 180 plus sims that I could just read and look at the kind of stuff people were investing in. And we had some returns data on those too. And so I was actually super interested in the question you're asking, David, because so many of these companies seemed like such well thought out investments made by such like talented and energetic entrepreneurs. How did this go so sideways? I would call the board members involved and ask them. And the great thing about the search fund community is they pick up the phone. I don't have a super like data-driven categorization of this, but the number one trend that I found was the seller. So you can't quantify that on a spreadsheet, but the behavior that I started taking as a result is when things start going well in a conversation with an owner, I actually started introducing them to the investors because they have way more of that radar, that EQ for, is this a trustworthy person? Because in these small little businesses, there's just so many ways to hide the cheese if you wanted to dupe a group that's trying to buy your business.
You're saying that at the stage where you are interfacing with the seller, there are things that you can learn or there are signals you can pick up that you might look back on and say, oh, we should have known.
Yeah. Is there something that comes up in the background check that signals this person has a history of unfair dealings or some sort of breach in ethics, especially in a business context? I would say don't walk away from those opportunities. Run away as fast as you can.
One thing that I can kind of say unequivocally, that during the search, you get to see the quality of the searcher. You can look at their pedigree up to when you give them the unit or multiple units, but until they actually search and you see how they think and the level of diligence that they're doing and their EQ and what they're bringing to you, it's very hard to get a sense of how successful they'll be. I would say from my, being the operator, being, what is my strength, having been around so many searchers, quality and not quality, unequivocally, there are character traits. There are specific character traits, and they're very rarely just within one individual. They're usually a bipartisan duo, and there's a lot of conflict in that partnership about the different resources that they bring, but they collectively bring a clear-eyed view of willingness to be coachable, resilience, all of these factors that allow them to perform a good search. We now give a lot less units and try to spend more time with a smaller group of people that we think are truly A players, because we think that they are going to have the EQ. You can only diligence these businesses so much because there's so many other factors that are going on that are macro, that at some point you are relying on the resilience and the factors of those searchers in those environments. And I liken that to many of the moments of the brown paper bags that Ben and I got ourselves out of while running ProService.
Dustin, as you look back at the outliers that you've been involved with, whether it was a 10x Griffin or whether it was a loss or an underperformance, how often are you surprised? And then how often do you say, oh yeah, well, it was that guy?
Very rarely in hindsight are we surprised, right? Because in hindsight, you see factors and you then do a comparative post exit. But during, Rich Kelly, back to Search Fund Partners, always says, this is an asset class that there's a lot of value in hanging around the hoop. There's a lot of these businesses that are kind of bumping along and a macro trend kicks in. Marcus Scott with outsourced video surveillance, who just sold a business for $150 million. Thank you, Marcus, helping us, with a nice outcome. He ran that business for like 9 years or 10 years, bumping along for like 6 of them, because nobody could ever envision that I would ever have my car lot not walked around with security guards. But the macro trend kicked in. He was in the right place at the right time, but he was also a great, resilient athlete of a searcher and hung in there and recapped the business and did what he needed to do. And then that market kicked in and everybody's like, oh, well, of course, everybody's outsourcing with AI now. And, there'll never be another security guard in the future. Well,
it's starting to sound like you need to do a lot of things right in order to give yourself a chance to have success. And the things that you need to do right are quite difficult. So that's the bad news. The good news is I'd love to hear from the three of you sort of what do you think should keep people excited and positive about the ETA opportunity? And, when you think about reasons to be optimistic about the growth and the future outperformance of the asset class, what do you think about?
When people ask me, hey, should I get involved in investing in search funds? Should I launch a search fund on my own? If you're passionate about small businesses, I think the answer is yes. I think in terms of the financial prospects, when Dustin launched his search fund, there were Dustin, like 10, 20 people who raised a search fund.
There were 8 active searches going on.
8 active searches. Okay.
We called it the Indian Ocean.
So I think it's still true today that the 8 most talented search fund entrepreneurs and entrepreneur groups are going to go on to achieve really, really great things. We're all entrepreneurs, so we all think we're in that top 8. In fact, there's like hundreds of us now. But I think small businesses are cool. And if you like doing that, then you should do it.
There's a reason since the late 80s that this asset class has outperformed. Are we going through a third turning? We are. There's no doubt about it. There's more money. There's a lot of mediocrity, is the best way to say it, that just kind of permeating everybody, their mother's trying to get a piece of it and struggle with it. Okay, fine. But I couldn't agree more with Daniel that the fundamentals have been tested. The tensile strength of the model is core. And while the Rubik's Cube is changing again, the fundamentals of the things that you look for in a great business are there. There's 350,000 businesses that are going to change hands in the next 5 to 8 years with the silver tsunami occurring. That's going to keep occurring. There's no better time to be buying lower middle market businesses. Cost of capital is going to come down. There's a ton of capital available. That just means you have to kiss more frogs. Now you've got technology that helps you kiss frogs virtually. We had to actually literally go kiss them. Now you can, talk to them on Zoom and find out that they suck.
I cannot think of a more compelling, more exciting, better post-MBA opportunity for young aspiring entrepreneurs. I just think this is such a fantastic way to try to build a career and, more importantly, how to build a life. I don't understand why people would want to go work at large professional service organizations or I just think for my students, who's my first and foremost audience, I think considering doing a search fund is just such a absolutely terrific post-MBA pathway. So it is not for everybody and it is not easy. You need to go into the game eyes wide open and understand the math and the probabilities. There was a time, I don't know if it was a decade ago or 25 years ago, where people thought they could just throw money at this and make 5 times their capital, like a monkey throwing darts at a dartboard. I don't think that's true by a million miles today.
There is no better model if you're not a founder, because I never had a brilliant idea in my life, but I was willing to work hard and above average smart. There is no better model if that's the world you want to take as an operator, period. As an investor, the sands have shifted. More opportunity than ever to be the operator, but more danger than ever as the investor if you are not cognizant of all of the pitfalls that exist and you just go to one of the top 5 business schools and get a unit. Well, you have a zero correlation to a good outcome there in that environment. Certainly, there are going to be much more binary outcomes than in the past. There are going to be very clear winners and there are going to be very clear losers where before maybe there was a tighter valence in the middle.
Excellent. Well, AJ Wasserstein of Yale School of Management, Daniel Lazier of Skyline Crest Partners, and Dustin Sellers of Next Coast Legacy. Gentlemen, I'd love to have you back on Search Party as you discover new things about the growing ETA asset class. And thank you so much for joining Search Party today.
Search Party is sponsored by Avid Bank, Boulay, Kilpatrick, Oberle, and Plexus Capital. The lead sponsor is Next Coast Legacy.